Welcome back to the Defence Pro podcast. I'm Stuart Webb, and with me is Dr. Chris Murray. He's made it clear that
I made him say that.
it's becoming a Canadian issue, according to him, that I'm not referring to him as Dr. Chris Murray. But today, instead of talking about the world
How
stage,
you doing, Stuart?
I'm good. How you doing today?
He's just trying to jump right into it, folks. I'm good too. Thanks for asking. So today you want to talk about Canadian procurement, right?
Yeah, definitely a page turn. Everyone in Canada is more in tune with. Well, let's put it this way: they're on the edge of their seats, wanting us to talk about us.
I think that the Canadian body politic is discussing defense more now than they have been in the last like 20, 25 years combined. It's become a pressing issue, and that's for a number of reasons that we can talk about here. And Stuart and I figured we might focus in on the F-35, our new fighter jet procurement, and our new submarine procurement. But what I would stress is that the reality is the Canadian military is in need of new everything because it's been punted down the road time and time again. And that's part of why it hasn't been talked about as much as it's being talked about right now. With the current geopolitical climate, which nobody really needs to spell out, I'm sure you're all aware of it. Canada's looking to spend more just like everybody else, and we need everything. And I think the F-35 and the submarine procurement are two really expensive and really complicated projects that could probably be used as a vehicle to highlight many of the issues going on and plaguing Canadian procurement, which is something that Stuart's been dealing with, what, I'd say nonstop for what, 600 years now, Stuart?
Yeah,
Probably
600 or
feels that way.
14 years or something like that. It's yeah. It's
Yeah.
funny, coming
Stuart's
back.
been doing it for a while.
Yeah. I mean, I came back from Aberystwyth with my master's degree thinking that I was going to be working on the Indian civilian nuclear deal with the United States and ramifications for, global politics. And I was thrown into, should we be buying the F-35? And what else is that the Harper government's trying to buy at the time?
It's an interesting point too that you brought up the Harper government because listeners should realize this is the second go at it for Canada. It was originally the Harper government, and then the for a number of reasons, some of which are just purely political, it was canceled and a new fighter jet procurement process, or what do they call that? A new tender was issued, Stuart? Is that what they call it?
I believe so,
A new
yeah.
competition?
Yeah.
And it came back with the exact same result, and which I recommended the F-35 again. So Prime Minister Trudeau, who had said we'd never buy the F-35, then went ahead and bought the F-35 that he canceled buying. But there are more than just political issues, and this is where Stewart can weigh in. There were legitimate concerns, some of which were voiced by you, Stewart, at the Rideau Institute, or was it when you were before you were at Rideau?
Before I was at the Rideau and during, and then at the same time I was at the Rideau and Stills with the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. And my job at that time was to go through the Harper's Defense Procurement deals, take a look at the products that they were wishing to go through, offer alternatives, and examine why we need these or why we don't. It definitely kept me
So
busy.
what were some of the, why don't you walk us, yeah, so why don't you walk us through some of the reasons why the F-35, why it was selected and what some of the concerns about it being selected were?
Well, essentially, the F-35 was selected because it's the new shiny toy that everyone else is buying too, right? It's supposed to be fifth generation, new helmets that the pilot can see 360. It'll be integrated with land, air, sea, and further as the project went, other uninhabited combat aerial vehicles, UCAVs, and it would just be Canada would be on the technological like deep side with its allies. On the other side, though, cost. Maintenance is high. The cost of the F-35 fluctuates. It keeps going up because it's still a plane in development. Also, the stealth material. Stealth material will flake off and needs to be reapplied. And that means those planes have to be sent back down to Fort Worth, Texas. And that stealth material needs to be rebaked onto the fuselage. So, as Canadian government right now wants to spend a lot of money, do they really want to spend the money sustaining these fleets? And that was kind of what Byers and I had talked about. One of the other things, of course, was the
Yeah,
F-35 and the Gripen are single engine aircraft. So if you lose that, unlike what we have with the Super Hornets we have right now, you don't have an engine. With the Super Hornets, there are two engines, so there is backup.
so this is, sorry, are we flying Super Hornets right now or we're flying regular Hornets
You're right.
and buying Super? Yeah. We're no, there's I'll explain this. There's a reason why Stewart made that Freudian slip because it's something I want to talk about. But before we do that, I'll just ex what you're talking about, Stuart, is just to simplify it, is it's a gold-plated jack. The criticisms is it's a gold-plated jack of all trades and therefore a master of none. And the arguments in favor of it are interoperability and being on the cutting edge with the US. And it's the only thing that'll be able to talk to the what do they call that? The whole battle space now where everything's wired into each other and everything's talking to each other. There's a special term for that.
The integrated digital battle space, I believe.
Yeah. Essentially everything from the soldier to the F-35 to the AWAC to the command control, everything is talking to each other. Is That's the idea. And the argument is apparently that only the F-35 could do this with its stealth capability and its, I think it's a $300,000 helmet that has to be custom fitted so you can see through the floor of the aircraft and things like that. And the arguments, this leads me to the arguments against, which is it's incredibly expensive. And as Stuart alluded to, it's the long-term maintenance that goes into it as well. This is something we talked about in our last podcast or the one before that. The one before that when I was talking about Europe moving away from the US is it's not just the upfront price, it's the maintaining this equipment. And as Stuart also alluded to, the F-35 it still has a number of I think it's David right over at David Pugliese over at Ottawa Citizens talked about it's tens of thousands, isn't it, of software issues? Like not hardware, but software is the big one that they're still working out. To be fair, that's true of every new aircraft, but does Canada A need that, and B can it afford it, and like is it interested in subsidizing that? I've heard convincing arguments from like Richard Shamuka over at
Shamuka.
the
Yeah,
hub.
Shamuka.
Yeah, about he makes I'm not going to try and summarize them because I wouldn't do them justice, but he makes some pretty compelling technical arguments in favor of it. But there's also the broader picture you have to look at, which is whether you actually need that and whether that's the most effective thing for Canada to have. I spoke to a buddy of mine when I was at King's and he was working at Bose Allen Hamilton at the time, but he was a retired US Marine. And one of the things he was talking about is how they'd much prefer Canada to be able to do something completely on their own, even a small thing, a small task, as opposed to offering one or two. And what we're looking at what, like 60 or 80 of these things? These
88.
F-35s?
88.
Versus, if you were to go with any other aircraft, and Stuart's already alluded to two of these, the Gripen by Saab, which was in the initial considerations, or the Super Hornet, which is the modernized, an upgraded version of what we're currently flying, the Hornet. Um,
Which would all own benefits of our maintenance crews, our pilots already trained essentially on it. It's essentially just an upgrade from what we have. So it would be a lot easier for a transition, RCAF.
well, this is especially true of the Super Hornet because yeah, this is especially true of the Super Hornet because it's essentially the same airframe, um, and the costs of operation and maintaining it are lower. And then the point I wanted to make is we could buy a heck of a lot more of them, which is a lot more useful. Because one of the things people have to understand is the rule of three, right? Like when you've got one in the air, you've got one in maintenance and one being used for training. So you don't really have 60, you have 20.
Yeah, and that's called the mission capable rate too, right? So I mean, with the order of the F-35, they're saying that Lockheed and the U.S. Air Force have been trying to get to 90% mission capable rate. So that means 9 out of 10 F-35s will be able to go on a mission and fly back. Right now, they're barely hitting
With
63%.
And Canada would need to do this with a new and largely, I won't say unproven, but a new aircraft that they're still working out the hinks and we don't necessarily have the money. It's going to eat up a massive portion of the RCAF budget. And that's the big sticking point for me is there's more affordable. Maybe they're not the cutting edge options, but we do fight an alliance, even just defending our own airspace with NORAD, right? And Stuart, something you'd said to me too is like we deal with the Arctic, which is the size of Europe, easily. And there's basically nothing up there. We don't have any airfields and things like that, which, when we shot down the balloon, the China, well, it wasn't us, it was the Americans, that Chinese balloon that was over the Arctic, right? Like
Yeah.
we couldn't even get up there to do it. And, one of that was actually another thing too, is the talk of like one versus two engine aircraft, because if one goes and you're up there, there's nowhere nearby to land. I mean, to be fair, there's plenty of one aircraft fighter jets that do just fine. F-16 comes to mind, but That's neither here nor there. The point is these are the things that are being discussed. And I think Stuart and I are both agree that it's certainly not the most cost-effective choice for the Canadian government.
And as you alluded to, Chris, I mean, eating of the budget for the RCAF, right? That means we can't upgrade the Globemasters we have or the Hercules, fixed wing search and rescue, even just training of pilots, mundane stuff, logistics of spare parts. All of a sudden, all that has to filter for
Or
the F-35.
the terrible helicopters,
We're not talking
not to
about
mention the
those.
terrible helicopters that Har Harper insisted on buying for, this is no, it's important because it brings us back to another issue with this, right? Is Harper hadn't done talked big on the military and hadn't done a damn thing. And so when the election was coming, he wanted to be able to say, look, we did something. And to be fair, the helicopter procurement is a long story and it's a disaster, and a lot of blame can be pointed at the Liberal Party and the Chrétien era. That's fine. That's neither here nor there. They rushed to get one done. They took a militarized version of a civilian aircraft nobody else flies, and everybody told them it was a disaster. It was a terrible idea. And sure enough, it is. Now they have to replace it again. They could
Yeah.
have just gone with Seahawks from the U.S. to begin with.
And at that time, I think the Seahawks had the U.S. Navy had, I think, 600 or 800 in service already, at least had built and had used. Uh,
They're swimming in this stuff. Yeah.
yeah. If anyone wants to do a search for a report that Dr. Byers and I had written, it would be the worst procurement in history, and that would be the Rideau Institute and the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives.
That explains the helicopter procurement.
That
Yeah.
explains the
Which is
helicopter
how I
procurement.
learned more of the details about it. Thing is with going with something like, for example, the Seahawk is the parts are available. We don't have to special order them, and that's what's going on with the Sikorsky helicopter. And now we're looking to replace it. And we're not going to have the money if we're flying the most expensive aircraft, and we're less useful to allies with fewer of them. So cheaper and more is probably the way to go. But it comes down to part politics. And Canadian U.S. relations plays a part in it, and another part of it too. That this is something that Stuart and I are going to want to talk about again. But the Canadian government, and this is both parties that govern. I mean, we have more than two parties, but only two of them ever have actually govern. The Tories and the Liberals, they both have this really nasty habit of trying to leverage defense procurement to appear to be creating jobs. And I say appear to be because they do create jobs, but they're not long-term sustainable in most parts, in most cases. So they do this thing that what's it called, Stuart? In
Ri-
industrial regional.
yeah, originally it was the industrial regional benefits, and now it's industrial technological benefits. So instead, we talked about is that you spend $1 on Canadian defense procurement, it has to create $1 of economic activity. Now it has to still create $1 of economic activity, but it also has to provide an industrial technological benefit to the wider industry. So if it's buying the
Canadian
F-35,
economy, which isn't
well,
always possible in Canada.
no. So if we're buying a submarine, it has to help with shipbuilding development. Sorry. F-35 has to help with Canada's aviation. And we've also seen deviations of this too. When we, like I had said about Quebec ski hills, the submarines right now, Hanwha Ocean and TKMS are looking to diversify all over, helping with lithium ion industry within Canada. Hanwha Ocean, I believe, also looked at
Their car are
cars. That was the big thing, wasn't it?
okay. So I'm going to put this in really sort of blunt terms here, but the Canadian military procurement is for sale. It can be bought, and it can be bought by investing in government plans where they can promote like promised jobs. So in the case of the submarine, Hanwha submarine is totally inappropriate for the Canadian Navy. This is like a no-brainer. It's larger. It has vertical launch tubes. Do we even like we're going to start carrying ballistic missiles and do vertical launch? The German version is smaller, more maneuverable. It's built for Arctic operations, which is what we're getting it for. On paper, this is a no-brainer, but basically the Koreans are buying their way in by saying, well, ours run on lithium ion batteries and we can help with the lithium ion battery technology here in Canada and create that industry because you guys are trying to build battery plants for cars, even though government spent a bunch of money on them and they're going nowhere. But the point is they can present this as like, look at how much extra we're getting. We're not just buying, look, we're buying the submarines we need. Well, no, you're not buying the submarines we need. You're buying submarines instead of the best ones we need that are best fit for our purpose. But they're doing that because these companies are coming in Understandably, because this is what the government's asking. It's not like these companies are trying to bribe us. Like this is what the Canadian government is asking for. But they're coming in and they're saying, okay, well, we can punt money into as part of this procurement program and building the submarine into like developing this, in some cases, pie in the sky. Sometimes it's legitimate and real, but these other industries to create jobs. And so what ends up happening is, I'm Stuart, you can tell me whether you think I'm right or wrong, but I think we're going to go with the wrong submarine simply because of the regional economic benefits. That's my fear, anyways.
Well, I mean, we'll see about that. I think the economic portion of the bid, I think it's 15%. I mean, it's not small, right? So that's why the Carney government and also the Ontario government has really been trying to push Hanwha Ocean to talk to South Korea and TKMS to talk to Germany to bring in South Korean or German car manufacturing into Ontario, and help diverse and invest into European and Asian cars instead of our traditional Fords, etc. from America.
And on surface, I've probably sound too harsh in what I just said, but like on paper, that doesn't necessarily need to be a problem, but it needs to be after, not before, right? Like pick the best thing and then go to them and be like, hey, we're yours is the best option. Can you work with us to do this? As opposed to the alternative, right? Like you look at the Koreans, right? They're not NATO for starters. They're not Five Eyes. They're vertical launch tube systems for the reality of the world they live in, being near China. It's not really appropriate for us. We're going to start stocking ballistic missiles now, and it's not fit for purpose. And if you're talking about interoperability with NATO allies, then there's another thing. There's another political consideration. But this is all coming down to like the money. And in the case of the F-35, it's also politics because why aren't they picking the F-35? Well, there's a lot of good reasons, and Stewart and I both, I think we both agree that we prefer to see the Canadian government going with the Super Hornet. But why are they talking about the Gripen? Well, the economics. And why else? Why are they talking about moving away from the F-35 after just committing to it? Because of politics. So this is my underlying, gripe of the day is Canadian procurement is far more concerned with, you know, personal political relationships between like, our prime minister and the US president or the bluster of the US president or with being able to say, look, I'm opening a new factory that may not even be open in 20 years or 10 years, but I'm not just wasting money on military because that's how they see it, wasting money on military equipment and it's not a waste. But look, I'm getting this back from it as
Well,
opposed to just being like, this is what we need. And it makes bad decisions because like the RCAF budget's going to get eaten by the fighter jet.
yeah, and the specter of industrial regional benefits. I mean, that's always been kind of in the background in play, but since the tariff war and all that, we've definitely seen that it's become the forefront, right? The debate about the submarine has not been about capability, like the original F-35 debate essentially was, right? It's just
Yeah,
about
at least
what
it was about the actual equipment, but this isn't about that at all. It's about the economics.
Defense Port published my report on the submarine acquisition already. It's found on our website. I believe it's called "From the Depths: Getting the Victoria Class Submarine Replacement Right." Something along those lines. I suggest everyone to download it and take a look. We've already had over 100,000 downloads for the report.
Yeah, Stuart, your report that you're talking about is a really helpful and probably less inflammatory way of digging into it than what I've just said. I just get really frustrated and passionate and like, I'm passionate about Canada and its defense and I get worked up. So I should probably like walk back some of the things I've said a little bit. But
I also want to walk forward a bit because Dr. Chris Murray is that he's also a former RCN officer.
yeah, so the Navy is in particular something that, is close to my heart. And I try not to leverage that and my limited time in there as some sort of like credential. But I I saw some of the things that were being said back, the early 2000s, and they're continuing to be said. Well, an entire generation of officers ride pine, sort of placeholding for the next generation, having been promised, that they would be captaining these new ships by the time they were like in their 40s, which is now. And we've got some of these DeWolf Arctic offshore patrol ships, but they're, quite frankly, pointless disaster, and that's why they've stopped making like they're cutting back the number of them. It's not a good choice. And I'm not Stewart, you've probably written something on this and can explain much better than I can why they were a poor choice. I mean, range is one of them,
Range
and
also
capability in ice.
capability. So they're not an actual icebreaker. They're ice capable, which means that they can go through first year ice, not anything, that's been around for any long time. Especially
They're lightly
growlers,
armed.
lightly armed, but
Yeah,
growlers. Growlers are little chunks of glacial ice that are just like floating around. So if you look up the MS Explorer, it was an ice strengthened hull off the coast of Antarctica, um, and that ship sunk only because it hit a growler, right? The same thing is
which is incredibly hard comp. Like it's like hitting rock. It's incredibly hard ice.
Yeah, and once again, I wrote a report about this when I was at the Rideau Institute like 10 years ago. So, well, 14 years ago, right? So, they keep going ahead with, these projects. They don't really make much sense sometimes. If you guys want to learn more about it, I suggest reading that report. I believe
Yeah,
it's
the main
called,
thing is they were able to say that they had an Arctic ship.
yeah,
And that's what was really motivating it when we don't even have a naval base up there and they can't get there. And this is the same thing that I'm sort of worried about happening with, our Type 26 frigates, which at the time they've selected them only existed on paper when the FREM was clearly the better choice. And it was a company that Fincantieri had actually built the FREM in other countries. They actually offered us a fixed rate of 35 billion back before COVID, which would have been a steal now.
yeah. And also go back to why we don't have an Arctic base up there. I mean, the part of the AOPS, at least it was known AOPS back then, the Arctic Offshore Patrol Ship,
I
part of
still
their
call them that.
Yeah, me too. The budget allocated $500 million to refurbish the mining base up in Nanisivik to be a port. But as costs grew, as it does with any military procurement, it ate into that budget, and therefore the base in
Yeah,
Nanisivik was.
basically they have some barrels of fuel up there. I mean, I'm being a little bit silly, but there's a lot of putting the cart before the horse, especially when the cart's missing a wheel, right?
Yeah. But that's just it, right? I mean, the thing about military, so we kind of alluded to this just now, military procurement projects. We talk about how a country should have an inflation rate per year, maybe 2 to 3%. Well, military inflation can go between 7 to 11% per year. So
Yeah, easily.
every year you delay, signing the contract and paying the money. Well, guess what? Your budget's going to be increasing every buddy year, right?
Hmm. Yeah, so this is circling back around. We want to talk about the F-35 and we want to talk about the sub. So I want to try and refocus our conversation here by summarizing a few things. F-35 is not necessarily a bad aircraft by any stretch, but it's one that I think is beyond the means of to borrow from Carney, a middle power to field, especially as their only aircraft. And now they're considering fielding that as well as the Gripen in a two aircraft fleet is just bonkers.
It's a horrible
It's the
decision.
worst option. It is the worst possible option, tenfold worse. Like they can't afford the F-35, in my opinion. They
No.
certainly can't afford because, and just so everyone understands, it means two sets of pilot training, two sets of maintenance crews, two sets of parts, blah, blah, blah.
Well,
Everything is doubled.
I want to go back to this like really quickly and back to the subs. So there was somebody in the PMO office last year who thought, you know what we should do? We should buy, six subs each. We'll buy six Hanwha, subs. We'll put them on the West Coast, and we'll buy six from TQS, and we'll put them on the East Coast. And just for that
And
reason,
that's the
right?
danger of having civilians who don't know anything about the military making
Well,
these decisions, flat
and
out.
Vice Admiral Topsheet came out like the next day to the press and said, "No, that's a dumb idea. We're not thinking about that." And then
Yeah.
later, Prime Minister Carney came out and said the exact same thing. And here's the
And now
reason,
they're
right?
talking about doing it with fighters.
No, exactly. And here's the reason why we're not doing it with the subs, right? We're not training two different types of crews. We're not having two different supply chains, two different mechanics trying to,
Supply
fix.
chains was the word I was about to use too, right? Because we
Yeah,
got to get those parts. We're not making them here.
right? And there's going to be Canadianization to both of those subs, right? And Canadianization can be going from having a North American plug versus a South Korean or German plug, for electrics, to how we operate in our country, right? So all of a sudden it has to be ARC capable with our oceans, whatever, right? It's with our equipment
Our
that's real,
facilities too.
yeah. So I mean,
because they got to come in.
yeah.
They
So
got to
there,
come into that. They got to, whether it's the port or the hangar or what the airfield, they got to be put somewhere, right?
so I love how that's option of buying two subs was quashed within, let's say, 48 hours when it came, out. But yet,
But it's
over a
close to
year,
becoming
we're
policy for aircraft. Yeah.
still talking about it for the
So
F-35 Gripen.
and again, this comes back to so again, to try and refocus. The F-35, it's not a bad aircraft. It's sort of beyond our means. It's a gold-plated jack of all trades. It's definitely the example of peacetime procurement versus wartime, right? Where it's incredibly complex and gold-plated, and we can't really afford it. We have cheaper options, but there's a political metric at play too, right? One of the reasons we wanted it was to placate the Americans, and one of the reasons we don't want it now is to stick it to the Americans, and that's not really an intelligent way to go about purchasing a piece of equipment. And these are long-term things. You have to think long-term. And you can't let the politics of the moment suddenly make you completely shift gears on this. Um, I understand why allies are apprehensive about the F-35, especially when Trump starts talking about he's talking about retarding abilities. I don't think that's something that needs to genuinely be concerned about.
Well, this
But
is this is interesting though, because back when I was working in Ottawa, back at the Rideau Institute, this was a concern, which is laughable now that we're having this conversation again. I remember there's a party staffer that came up to me once and said, "We need to talk to you need to start looking into what he would refer to as an F-35 Delta, right?" I was like, "What the hell are you talking about?" There's A, which is the traditional aircraft
yeah,
takeoff, B, the STOVL, and then the C, the carrier takeoff. What the hell's D? And he was started talking. Well, no, it's our concern. We've had other people talk to us that the F-35 might be retarded for its allies that would be slightly less capable. I was like, what? Really? And after I did searches and, did talk to, Lockheed guys, and everyone was laughing in my face when I brought this up. Like, no, they're not going to do that.
well, I
It,
mean, they're talking the between saying and doing wise to see the Americans can say that, and maybe they're seriously thinking about doing it for some people, but to their NORAD partner, I think it's unlikely. I just
no.
my big concern with the F-35, if we're gonna fixate on that, which is fine, is that it's too complex and expensive for us to without massively increasing the budget, and at a time when, as I said at the beginning of this, we need to buy everything
Yeah.
because we've put so we don't have the luxury of dedicating that much to it. And the same is sort of the the same sort of arguments apply to the submarine, where it's not so much the gold plated so much as it is the political decisions or the economic, and that's the one that really gets under my skin because the men and women in uniform deserve the best equipment, and then you figure it out what the economic benefits. Not, well, we bought you a submarine because you said you wanted a submarine, even though it's totally unfit for purpose. Shut up and take it. You got your submarine, and we get to say go out and do some ribbon cutting and say, look at this factory and look at this one, right? And in most cases, they're not going to be there in a generation
No, and
because you look at U.S. naval procurement, right? The reason why those ship facilities are able to stay open is because the U.S. Navy's constantly buying new and constantly decommissioning. They're not buying one set of ships every 25 years sorry, not 25. We're talking what, 35, 40 years, right? Like the
yeah.
last Halifax came in the early 90s. That was like a 10-year delivery window. So that's like 80s and 90s. And now we're talking about getting them. Well, when they started talking about this, they were supposed to already be in the water by 2025. And now we're talking, 2045 when the Halleys are supposed to be out of the water by now, you know?
Yeah.
So
And
this is
let's
my underlying point, though, is this, the politics, the economic benefits, the other political factors being made, and the decisions being made by people who are just not qualified. So they're allowing those metrics to be put in place.
yeah, let's take a look at the Canadian defense budget. Okay, yeah, right now we want to spend and build everything and renew the Canadian Armed Forces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a threat from Russia, we have a threat from China. We're not looking at small wars, but let's get into that to another podcast. But 30 years ago, from now, let's say, 2020, sorry, 2056, will the Canadian budget still be at, 3.5% for, defense spending? and
instead of
one.
five where it's supposed to be.
Well, the five is the 1.5 I left out because that's for infrastructure builds, right? So, let's say three and a half. Will we still be at three and a half within, the next, 25 years? Like, no,
Well,
it's
there's a
probably
few
it'll be going back down. And if we buy F-35s or equipment that we don't need and is too expensive when it comes to sustainability, then all of a sudden, when our budget's back down to 2% or lower, I hate to even think about that. We've got a now even defunct armed services, right?
basically there now, quite frankly. We even had Wayne Air essentially say that before our chief of the defense, our previous chief of the defense staff say that on his way out. There's a lot of things going on. One of the things too, and I'd like to take a shot here is I don't think the top brass they're too political and not nearly concerned enough with the military, and they need to start telling truth to power more vocally. I was a great admirer of Wayne Air's willingness to actually put his ass on the line and say some things publicly that needed to have been said. Like that's part of it, and part of it is like they're the government needs to understand who the professional practitioners are and listen to them, right? There's a need to and to do that, you also the government has we've talked about this before. There's no white paper. There's no real definitive sort of conception of what we're going to be asking the military to do and how we're going to be doing it and where, right?
Yeah,
And
the last podcast we talked about this, and yeah, we need to be we need the
we
first we need the foreign policy paper to say, hey, this is
yeah.
where Canada is, right? And then we need the white paper, and then with those two documents, our foreign policy service and also the Department of Defense the bureaucrats can actually look at where we're going to be, and then plan for it, right?
Well, I'll say this. I think that this might be the most off the rails podcast that Defense Report puts out just because Stuart and I are both Canadian. And so this one I apologize to people listening. I think we made some really good points, Stuart. I just worry that we're very close to this one. So it's hard to talk about it in a way that is dispassionate and objective and clear. And it's tough to be clear and to just lay out the case. So I'm hoping that those things come through the sheer rage and desk banging and screaming into the microphone that Stuart and I are trying to resist. It might give you some sense of the state of the larger defense discussion and how I don't think Stuart and I are alone in feeling. I'm sure the frustration's coming through. I don't think we're alone on
I don't agree entirely because I know that I've got dents on my desk today,
that.
right? Yeah, Chris does raise a good point. I mean, our audience so far has been American, it has been UK. We've got French, Spanish, Ukrainian, Japanese. We've been around the global a bit already. We do talk primarily about world affairs. Yeah, and we got a good Canadian audience too, just because that's where we are. I've listened to other podcasts too, especially like the Ukraine the latest, and they talk about defense spending in the UK, and they know that other countries like Canada are going through the same thing.
Yeah, that's a really fair point that we haven't discussed too, is that this is not a uniquely Canadian situation. Canada is uniquely bad, or maybe that's not the right way of putting it. Canada is one of the worst offenders.
We have a
These
track
this
record.
UK in particular, they're having a really tough time over there. They're not where we are in terms of like lack of capability, but they're certainly having a lot of problems. Australia is struggling too, right? New Zealand's really struggling. Most of Europe is. France, Germany. That's actually a really important point, is it's not the only one. But so maybe listeners will be able to appreciate and apply this to their own country. But it usually you and I are pretty dispassionate and cautious in the way we talk about things because we're disconnected from them. But this is one that we're really close to. So you sort of that has a value though, because I think it probably demonstrates just how much frustration is felt. And I'm sure that if you were to talk to Brits about the British situation, they would sound the same way. I can
Spe
say that with absolute certainty about the British.
Especially if you talk about Ajax.
Right. The Ajax. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the Ajax. Yeah, that thing's
Yeah.
a disaster. I don't know, Stuart. Do you want to keep beating on this dead horse or do you want to call it there?
I mean, you are entirely correct that we need to figure out what we should be buying and then maybe work the economic clause and deals afterwards. But the issue is that the framework of that industrial regional benefits clause started with Pierre Elliott Trudeau during the Cold War, right? So there was a better idea of what we need to buy back then. And now we've walked into this new multipolar world of, competing actors.
Yeah, I
So,
mean that's a fair point. This is something that's been going on a pretty long time too.
yeah. Anyways, I think you're absolutely right. So we should probably wrap this up now. But again, everyone, thank you very much for listening to the
For
Defense
this,
Force podcast.
yeah, for this defense report therapy session, Canadian therapy session.
Oh God, totally right.
Yeah,
Anyway,
thank you for putting up with it, listening to our ranting, and as for joining us as always.
all right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.